if poetry is about experience first and foremost, it is the kind of thing that can open you to other experiences. It's the kind of thing that can explain experiences, and it's the kind of thing that can make available new experiences that you have never had before.
Hi, and welcome.
Hi.
I am Jude Trang. Thank you for joining me on the Gift of Need podcast. The podcast seeks to address human need in society and how it relates to all our relationships and shapes our behavior and society as a whole. And it hopes to show that our needs are not burdens, but actually gifts and opportunities. My guest today is Dr. Abram Van Engen, author and professor. Hi, Abram.
Hi, how are you?
I'm good. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining me today and taking time out of your busy schedule.
Absolutely.
Abram is, I'm going to read this because it's a little bit long, is the Sammy Elkin Professor in the Humanities, Chair of the English Department, and Director of the John C. Danforth Center on Religion and Politics at Washington University in St. Louis. He has published widely on religion and literature, focusing on two subjects, Puritans and poetry. That's our subject, the second. It has led to his award-winning book, Word Made Fresh, an invitation to poetry for the church, and also to his podcast, available online, called Poetry for All. So you have quite an array of accomplishments. Can you tell us a little bit about your upbringing and background?
Sure, I grew up in South Bend, Indiana. My dad was a professor at Notre Dame. He was a medievalist. And so I grew up in South Bend, and I went to Calvin College for undergraduate and did my PhD at Northwestern. And from there, I went to Texas for my first job and came to WashU in 2012. So I've been at this now for a long time, but I've always been in the realm of in the humanities. I love the humanities. I love books. I love ideas. I love the way ideas travel. And if I can ever get a book in somebody's hand, I've done a good deed.
Yeah, right. I know when I was setting up for this morning, I had to move stacks of books off my car.
I love that. That's great.
And it's like, I can't get rid of them. They're like children, all of them.
Yeah.
They're just, and they've all have such important things in them. And,
Yeah.
Well, today, folks, we're going to be discussing why we need poetry. Many of us grew up, with nursery rhymes, but as we grew older, poetry as a literary form wasn't something that we read for pleasure. At least I didn't. And I want to ask, Abram, would you share with us your journey into poetry, which seems different from some of your professional accomplishments?
Yeah, sure. So the way I tell it in the book is, I mean, the poem that really opened the door to poetry for me is As Kingfishers Catch Fire by Gerard Manley Hopkins. And the reason it kind of opened the door to poetry for me is that it's actually a very difficult poem. It's a difficult poem to get the meaning of. And some people assume that all poetry is that way, but it's not. But this poem is that way. And the reason it kind of opened the door for me is that it was so beautiful. The language of it, the sound of it, the music of it, it was so beautiful. And it demonstrated up front that something else was going on beyond the simple delivery of a message. And it opened the door because it made me realize that poetry is about more than the delivery of a message. We have lots of great genres for delivering messages, like letters and treatises and sermons and all kinds of things that were just like, here's what you need to know, right?
Right.
Poetry is not like that. And so it got me wondering, what is poetry about and what is it trying to do? And sometimes poems are very, very simple to read and understand, and yet they're still doing something more than delivering a message. And that's kind of what opened the door to poetry for me.
I grew up reading and reciting rhyming poems, and I think as all kids do in elementary school. And I have struggles with modern poetry and free verse. And it seems to me, when I've talked about this with my other poet friends, that it's the lack of rhythm and beat, at least how I perceive that, right? And maybe it's because I'm a musician and I've written songs which are poems set to music, right? And the quote from Bob Dylan that I love is that I consider myself a poet first and a musician second. I
Mm.
live like a poet and I'll die like a poet.
Well,
And
he won the Nobel Prize for poetry, didn't he?
yeah, I think so. But it's the rhythm and melody that then take those words and make the poem work for me. Do you think I'm
Hmm.
unique in that?
No, I mean, I think that a lot of people have a notion of modern poetry as particularly as something that's lost its way. And what I try to tell people is, first of all, free verse is quite difficult to write. It's not just a free for all. It's not just whatever you want and you don't have to think about it. It's actually more difficult in some ways because you have to find the form that fits the subject. And you still need rhythm and meter, and you still need ways of making musical the composition that you're undertaking. And so free verse, if you can find the music in it, can be quite beautiful. But I would also say that free verse is one form of modern poetry, and there are still lots and lots of poets writing sonnets and villanelles and sestinas and pantoums and all the rest. So there's still very structured poetry being produced even as we speak. And so when people say modern poetry, it's the same as like in an art museum when they say, "Oh, I don't like modern art."
Right.
But then what they mean is one particular sliver of modern art is what they don't like, and what artists who are living are doing is a whole wide variety of things.
Right. And thinking about it, I agree, and I understand what you're saying. So, I've enjoyed your podcast with Joanne Diaz and Poetry
Oh yeah.
for All. And in listening to it, I can see how important being taught to read a poem is. I can't do it and I lose the ability to enjoy the poem, right? But when I hear a poet read with those appropriate, like the inflections and the meter and where to stress and where not, when they're done right, then begin to understand what's being said. And a friend of mine who is a poet here in town and has published a bit, when she reads her poems to me, then I get it. But
Yeah.
just me reading it, there's something that I lose in there.
Yeah. I don't think that's unusual at all. And it actually points to the fact that poetry for years and centuries before it was ever a written art was always a spoken art. I mean,
Mhm.
that's where poetry began. It began as something to be heard, not something to be read. And it still lives as something most often and best heard rather than read. In fact, what I tell people in the book is if you want to try to get into poetry, if you find a poem that kind of works for you, um, get yourself into a private space and read it out loud. Work on how you might read it out loud because poetry is very often a kind of performance. And the point of a poem is always that performance and what happens in the midst of that performance. Even when you're reading quietly to yourself, you're trying to hear it and live it and experience it in a kind of performance.
Yeah, that's a good word because I think there's something about that the auditory part of it, even if it's
Yeah.
your own voice, that
Yeah.
helps put those stresses and
Well, you see this with Shakespeare all the time, right? I mean, if I were to say to a high school student, here, read Hamlet, they would say, what the heck is going on in Hamlet? But if they go to Hamlet and they see it performed, they know exactly what's going on. It's not trouble. There's no trouble there, right? So they know exactly what's going on as it's performed. They can follow the play. It's fine. And sometimes it's the same with poetry. To hear it spoken, to see it performed, brings it alive in a much different way.
I absolutely agree, and I think I also wonder too. I'm a real concrete thinker. I have trouble with the abstract, and maybe this is why I have difficulty with many poems. The lack of predictability, I think, and maybe also the need for patience because
Mm,
no matter how old I get, I am still an impatient person. That's just how I came out, and maybe I think our society as a whole has become impatient because of the way in which we receive information now. It's quick, you can just get
yeah.
it like this. And also the demands for focus and sustained attention and engaging with something is unappealing, because we can get our whatever you call it, our buzz so much more quickly, right? And maybe this is also why poetry has declined in popularity. Maybe it's requiring us to think deeply and analyze, analyze the figurative and the complex word usage. I mean, I have to make myself focus. And
Yeah.
I think is that a cultural thing, do you think?
It could be, and it's an interesting question because people lament the decline of, say, reading long novels. They say, "Oh, the younger generation has no long attention span anymore, and they can't read long novels." I don't know what to make of that claim, but then you say, "Well, what about a short poem?" And they say, "Oh, they can't focus. That requires too much attention." So, it's an interesting kind of lament about attention and focus. I do think that poetry can be read multiple kinds of ways. Billy Collins has this wonderful poem called Introduction to Poetry, and in the midst of it, he offers a variety of ways of encountering a poem. But one of those ways, he says, I asked them to water ski across the surface and wave at the author on the shore. Like, just read it, just move through it, just see what you get out of it as you go. When people ask me, how do you read poetry, or how do you get into starting to read poetry? I say, well, it's not that different than picking up any other book and starting to read. I mean, you can read a book of poetry from beginning to end in about an hour, maybe sometimes 2 hours. And it's worth trying that experience without sort of forcing yourself into a really concentrated metaphysical experience with every poem. Just sort of read the thing from cover to cover and see what happens as you do that. But then some poems will sort of demand your attention in new ways. And it's that demand that both makes poetry necessary and is a kind of invitation to you, to the reader, to think a little differently.
Mm. Well, I really love your podcast, and
Hmm.
I can tell you are definitely have a gift for teaching. I've learned so much about the variety and forms of poetry, like a pantoum. That was a
Yes.
word. That's a great word, isn't it? It's like
Yeah.
something ancient about it. I don't know what it is, but
Yeah.
and one I particularly loved was when you and Joanne read and discussed Shelley's Ozymandias. Maybe because I'm an Egyptophile, I love all things
Yeah.
ancient Egypt and culture. But the word pictures I found that Shelley used, well, they caused us to think about the nature of empires and leaders. It was just brilliant. So you can just see the picture of the big statue in the sand and the legs,
Hmm.
and I wonder, since you know so much poetry, have many writers used their poems to share a truth or a challenge or warning for society? And can you give us an example or of that?
Oh, for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's actually in some ways the most common form of poetry right now is a kind of what there are a couple different ways of thinking about it, but one way of thinking about it is a kind of poetry of witness. That is, to what extent can the poet witness to a kind of injustice, draw our attention to it, and ask us through the very witness of it to respond. And so poets for ages, of course, have done this, but especially recently to say, what is going on here? And to try to challenge people to respond, to act, to see, to do. And so, I mean, for example, like probably one of the most famous books of this sort of poetry of witness sort is Claudia Rankine's Citizen that came out. But there's a whole long line of this in lots of different spheres, but also a particularly strong strain of it in, for example, African American poetry,
Mm.
sort of saying, from the abolitionists forwards, are saying, are you seeing this? How are you responding to this? What are you going to do about this?
Right.
And so, yeah, that's a very powerful strain of poetry.
Well, when I think of what you mentioned, Shakespeare, the classical poetry, like Shakespeare or Byron, your thought is that they themes of love and beauty, right? They profound emotions of passion and that tend to inspire, um, poetry, the expressing those complex feelings. and the imagery and the metaphors, I think, increase that impact to our senses. So, do you think that modern free verse, maybe I should just say not modern, just free verse,
Yeah.
conveys the same power or resonates love,
Yeah.
beauty in the same way?
Yeah, I mean, I'll give you a couple examples. So, one of the big turns toward free verse was in Walt Whitman. And Walt Whitman kind of transformed poetry both by sort of saying, you know, let's make our own forms for a new age, but also in this expansive sense of trying to get at precisely those kinds of themes of beauty and love, but also like democracy and to just give you a sense of the way form and function work together. The lines on his page are enormous. They go on and on. They don't even hardly fit on the page. And why is that? What's he doing there with those very, very long lines, which are very carefully rhythmic? Well, what he's doing is he's trying to say America itself, he's often writing about America, is so big and so vast with so many kinds of people in it that it can't possibly fit. And so the lines themselves don't fit on the page. And he'll offer these sort of catalogs, these lists of all the various kinds of people he'll see on a dock, for example. And it's a way of trying to get you into the experience of just this kind of this moving experience of democracy. But I'll give you another example, more recent. Lee Young Lee, who's one of my favorite poets, uh, he's got this poem From Blossoms, which is about joy. And it's very hard to do joy well in a poem. It often gets a kind of bad rap, or it starts to feel a little sappy or something. This is a wonderful poem about joy. Again, he invents the form that he needs for it, but it's all the concrete imagery around eating a wonderful peach on a summer day. That's it. That's what the poem's about. And it expands from there into this incredible repetition of the incredible blossoms that produce, the hands that produce this peach, everything that went into the possibility of the moment of eating this peach on a summer day. Nothing more simple. And yet, it's just one of the best poems about joy that I've ever read.
Huh. Well, I think poetry and spirituality seem to have also been deeply entwined through history,
Yes.
not just love and passion, right? And I think this relates to how our faith doesn't just sit in the logical part of our brain and the analytical life, but also in our emotions and our souls.
Hmm.
You know, pondering those unknowable aspects of the universe and our world and God. I think of the Psalms in the Old Testament that are so varied. You know, they go from happy and everything's
Hmm.
wonderful to very deep, and they express confusion and pain. And so clearly the writers were in touch with their feelings. So do you think that reading and writing poetry cultivate awareness within ourselves and the intangible world? Does it have that ability?
Absolutely, it has that ability. In fact, I think that's one of its greatest abilities, both the writing and the reading of it. I think if poetry is about experience first and foremost, it is the kind of thing that can open you to other experiences. It's the kind of thing that can explain experiences, and it's the kind of thing that can make available new experiences that you have never had before. But if you think about the Psalms, I mean, that's a perfect example. I think sometimes people read the Psalms as a hunt for meaning. What does Psalm 12 mean? What does, Psalm 23 mean or whatever? But if you think about the actual usage of the Psalms, they are repetitions of experience that allow you to encounter God. They're not primarily about a particular set of meanings. They're primarily about an encounter with God made possible through poetry. One third of the Old Testament is written in poetry. It's written in verse. Why is that? What's going on there? Well, part of it is that the words themselves and the way in which they are formed and crafted are trying to make available an experience of God. That's how poetry works. That's why it's in scripture, and that's what the Psalms are doing. It's also why the monks sang and chanted and repeated them every week, all 150 every week for centuries now.
That's dedication. But
Yeah.
there was something driving them to that. And Well, you have recently released a new award-winning book entitled Word Made Fresh, an invitation to poetry for the church. Can you tell us a bit about it and what led you to write that book?
Yeah, so this came out of after having started the podcast and then building on that, building on my own teaching of poetry in churches for many years. I wanted to write a book that would invite people, first of all, to notice that there was poetry in Scripture, but then second of all, to ask, what does that allow us to do with poetry that's not in Scripture? How might we want to encounter it? What might it do for our spiritual lives? What might it do for our lives in general? And so it really is an invitation to say, hey, if poetry is this important to Scripture, then what about poetry beyond Scripture? Can we what's happening in that world, and how might I begin to enter into it if I just had an inkling of curiosity about it?
Mm.
What's possible in that world? And for someone who never reads poetry, which is really the primary audience of that book, um, where might I begin, or how might I begin? I love, in particular, teaching poetry to the church because the church really has a leg up on this. The church does poetry as part of its practice, and it always has in the hymns, in the liturgies, in the psalms. Poetry is just part of the practice of the church and always has been. And so, actually, inviting Christians who go to church to say, well, this thing you already do, how might it expand? And how might that expand life and the experiences of life for you? So that's kind of what the gist of the book is about.
Well, and just in hearing you say that, I think about music because my husband and I were in a band for the 10 years he was in school and grad school, and wrote songs and played them. And it is interesting that Christians are the people who sing the most about every different thing, which is really poetry, but
Hmm.
it's poetry with the music, right? So in the uh, when you think about it, Christians don't just listen to Christian music or Christian hymns, right? We listen to a broad variety of music. We try to avoid things with offensive lyrics and stuff, but I like pretty much every kind of music,
Hmm.
every genre. And they don't have to be talking to me about God per se, but
Right.
they're telling me about things that are human experiences and human needs that we have. We have a need to express
Yeah,
ourselves. And
absolutely.
so I think what you're saying is that on the side of reading poetry to expand out beyond Christian verse and in the Bible or Christian poetry in general is the same that I would
Yeah.
say too, that we enjoy a whole variety. There's so many um, gifts that are in the
Yeah.
world that people that may not know God the way we do, they may not know that their gifts come from Him, but it broadens it. So I love the idea
Yeah.
of your book. Do you think of reading or writing poetry as a spiritual practice that can enrich our lives? And as it does, is there a potential for it to increase our compassion and understanding of others with whom we may be very different? Is
Yeah.
it it is a way that we can blend with our world even if we don't hold the same values?
Yes, I think absolutely. I mean, I would never make it a causal claim. I would never say, "Oh, if you read these poems, you'll become a better person." Like it's just, but I do. What I would say is that reading these poems um, has the potential to shape and change you and open your awareness to others and their needs. We're told in Romans 12 to rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. Well, how do we begin to do that except through the imagination? We've got to begin to see things from their perspective, to understand the world from what they are going through. And poetry is an avenue to open that world to us. It's a playground of the imagination that can open us to compassion and all other kinds of things. And so I think it's just not something we want to cut off. It's a tool and a resource for our imagination that's fundamental to what we're called to be and to do as followers of Christ.
Mm. Well, that is definitely um, high mark, a high goal for you to reach towards for this body of people who follow God. So let me ask you this. Could you read us a poem, either one of
Sure.
yours or someone else's?
I'll read you one of my favorite poems. And again, this is a poem you don't have to ask what it means. You'll know what it means.
Okay. All
But
right.
it's
Are
a,
you
you know,
sure
it's
of that? Are you sure?
absolutely.
If I don't get it, I'm not admitting to it right now.
This is called Those Winter Sundays. Sundays, too, my father got up early and put his clothes on in the blue-black cold. Then, with cracked hands that ached from labor in the weekday weather, made banked fires blaze. No one ever thanked him. I'd wake and hear the cold splintering, breaking. When the rooms were warm, he'd call, and slowly I would rise and dress, fearing the chronic angers of that house, speaking indifferently to him, who had driven out the cold and polished my good shoes as well. What did I know? What did I know of love's austere and lonely offices? That's by Robert Hayden,
Wow.
20th century poem.
Wow. Well, I am I have a lot to think about, right? So um, we could go on, but I tried
We
to keep
could.
the podcast to a little 30-minute segment. So
Sure.
thank you, Abram, for making the time and taking the time out of your busy schedule as a professor and a husband and speaker and author, and to talk about the needs that we all have for beauty and honesty in our lives, and expressing that through poetry, and how it can become an opportunity for the poets to use their gift to share and bless and benefit others personally and corporately, and meet the needs for other people who need to hear a word of encouragement or truth or beauty. These are just how we are. This is how we were made. We have these needs for joy and fulfillment. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes. Thank you.
All right, folks, you can check out Abram's work on his website. It's abramvanengen.com, and it will be in the show notes so that you can see how to spell it correctly. And also by listening to his podcast, Poetry for All. That's on all the streaming services. The great music you're hearing was written and performed by Gabe Kubanda at Kubanda Music. You can find him on any streaming service. The engineer is Ray Engineering of 3rd Street Productions here in beautiful Tucson, Arizona, where I'm coming to you from. Thank you, and please consider following and rating and sharing this podcast and subscribing to my free Substack newsletter, where all of these things are available and the links for this podcast also. So leave a comment or review. I'd love to hear from you. Bye.
Thank you.